Yes, Hugh Murray's book, Photographs of Photographers of York, 1844 to 1879. Recently, we sold our last copy. Now, fortuitously, we had a donation from a YAYAS member of £3,000. What could we do with this? So we tried various printers, eventually settling on full print on Heslington Road, just off Heslington Road there. And they scanned a copy. I sacrificed my copy, and they've sort of scanned it and reprinted it with obviously much thicker paper than the original, better quality, and of course a little inscription in the front, which I'll come to. Just move on. Yeah, that is now in the flyleaf at the front. This second printing has been produced as a tribute to and appreciation of the work of Hugh Murray, 1932 to 2013, who served for many years as chairman of YAYAS. It is also produced in memory of his late wife, Jill Murray, 1938 to 2023, who was the granddaughter of the stained glass artist John Ward Knowles of Stonegate. One of the upshots of this is that YAYAS has been bequeathed many slides from Hugh and Jill Murray's collection. And I can also not let the cat out of the bag too much. The YAYAS Great Seal was on Hugh Murray's library mantelpiece, behind a stuffed harvest mouse next to a carriage clock. So we now have the Great Seal, and steps are being taken to get a new wooden box for it to put it in its new home in the Minster Library. Hasn't been seen for many years. It's about 10 inches high. It's a very heavy material, not bronze. It's almost like jet or obsidian, but it's a wonderful thing to have back. A bit of our missing kit that now goes back in our archive. So the wonderful thing about doing this talk is that the notes are in the book in front of me about the earliest days. So Hugh himself, the photo on the left was in his archive. Thank you, Rita. It was really wonderful to go to the memorial service for Jill. And Tony Knowles, Jill's brother, handed me a coffee bag with the seal in it. I believe this is yours, John. And then Rita gave me the modern technology, 2 Seagate hard drives with 29,000 images on one USB stick. We've now duplicated it, and it's with our archivist and with Sandra Garside Neville. It'll take years to sort out the copyright and separate out the duplicates, but there are a lot of ones we've seen before in there. There are some excellent colour photos. There is the book by John Smith's Brewery on the rebuilding of the Plumber's Arms into the Cock and Bottle. There are photographs of every page of that. So it's bits like that. It's all got to be sifted out into what's archive and what's photos. So we'll carry on. In the beginning, the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1844. John Bibby did a great day conference on this in the library a few years ago, where the great and the good came to foreground the latest science, the latest developments, but also the photographers. Hill and Adamson set up their darkroom in a corner of the ruins of St. Mary's Abbey. And they were using, well, the early daguerreotype, calotype. The calotype process basically involves things like silver nitrate and iodide, and the chemicals would leach out. The problems with things like calotype is you get a very thin negative. So if you ever want to do a reproduction, it's literally a contact print, which is why a lot of the early photographs look like cartridge paper, because that's what they're on. They're on very heavy cartridge paper. So they've been reproduced many times, and now the digital copy is a perfect copy. So David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson, they're the ones who set up. Now, to be honest, they mainly dealt with portraiture, because the wonderful thing, if I went back to that print, when you realise the great and the good at the bottom of that image are more or less graphic cartoons of who was there. Well, Hill and Adamson could take photos of those who were there. Most of their photos, I think, are in the National Gallery or the National Archives at Kew in their collections. But we do have this photo of David Octavius Hill. Their photos are obviously very early, long exposure, about 15-20 minutes. Now, obviously, the south door of York Minster, and it's worth thinking that some of the gentlemen with their long black coats and stovepipe hats are probably members of the British Association meeting on the steps of the Minster, because, as I said, their photos at the meeting were mainly portraits. There are very few shots of anything building-wise. There are a couple of photos of the Minster. That's one I found on a national site. There's a much better one in the book, I must say. But then, of course, you can't think about the pioneers of photography without William Henry Fox Talbot. Fox Talbot leased out his technique to many of the early photographers, so they're really adopting his calotype process. He did take many in York. Sorry, this one's a bit bluish. Obviously, King's Staith. We all recognise the pub, you know, later the Richard III. I'm sorry, the King's Head on the River Ouse. The large Tudor building, 4 stories high, with gables and attics, disappeared shortly afterwards. This is about 1852. And of course, you've got the water lanes. If only he'd taken a picture of one of the water lanes, but probably it wasn't aesthetically pleasing enough and a bit too dingy for him. So that's a Fox Talbot. And of course, one of the earliest shots of Micklegate Bar. And again, you get the impression that it's this cartridge paper that it's printed on. On the left, this led to quite a bit of interest recently. The city wall to the left of Micklegate Bar was showing signs of cracks. So it was decided to repair the cracks. And then when Anna Cook dropped me an email saying that we're in the archive and we're looking for all the urinals that were built in 1852 at all the bars, which of course is in one of Hugh's books, Where to Go in York. And I said, well, actually, try looking at 1862, because that's when the second arch was being built and the loo was pushed back. Oh, yes, we found it. So, yes, clearly that's before. And of course, you can't see it, but the chimneys in the background will be the chimneys of the Jolly Backers pub. So that is just about the earliest possible picture of Micklegate Bar, with St. Thomas's Hospital on the right. We all know that was rebuilt later on, the bottom of Nunnery Lane. There's always some problem about that strange thing. If that's, as you say, the 1860s photos show the hospital there. Well, it was rebuilt on Nunnery Lane. Why hasn't it gone? Well, you had to keep the old one open whilst the new one was being built, or you'd have nowhere to put the patients. Like rebuilding a bridge, you have to keep a connection. So the building did hang on for a few more years. Fox Talbot's pictures are really quite clear, not as good as the later Wilson ones we'll see later on. That one is actually in the book. And again, it's a print on paper, dry type process. And again, a few figures scattered around who must have been posed by Fox Talbot or be his friends. That's why they're in the image. If they'd moved so much as a foot, they would have been a blur. There's a 15-minute exposure. The one we know in York really is William Pumphrey. Look at his notes in the book. Yeah. Born in 1817 in Worcester, the eldest son of a Quaker glover, he attended the Friends' School at Thornbury in Gloucester. Came to York around 1845, became a science teacher at Bootham's School during the headmastership of John Ford. Photography was then emerging as a new art or science, and it had aroused Pumphrey's interest. Then in 1849, he left teaching to start a photographic portrait gallery in Coney Street, York's first business devoted entirely to photography. So in 1852, Fox Talbot offered all his patent rights and Pumphrey took it up. So again, Pumphrey's picture, that's taken from a bit further back than Fox Talbot, as you can see. Now, it is so clear that if I put it side by side with the 2007 picture, and I took that in 2007, and unwittingly, I've captured the 1951 celebration street lamps on Duncan Place, which have since been removed. And I thought, for a bit of fun, as it's such a clear photograph, why don't I combine the two? So yes, it took a few hours, Photoshop and things like that, but the alignment was such, I managed to imagine what Duncan Place would look like if Lop Lane still existed. And of course, a few years earlier, you would have had High Minster Gates at the end. But it just shows again how how much has changed in the past few years if I separate them out again and combine them. So if you see me around York taking photos from very typical angles, I'm probably going to try and do some more of these. Pumphrey's, one of Pumphrey's greatest photos, in my view, is the one he took across the Ouse towards the Minster. Now, this one's quite complex, so I'll try and whiz through. It is quite a dark print, again, being on paper, but clearly you've got the city walls going on the left-hand side towards Barker Tower. Lendal Tower is on the other side of the river. In front of the Minster is a small building you can see with what looks like a dome just below the picture of the Minster there. That is still there. It's Pritchett's Congregational Chapel on Lendal. A few months ago, I was showing some people on a walking tour that the back of the chapel was still there. But there is a tenant in the building next door who keeps shouting it, saying, "That's a private road, go away." To which I said, "I was here first." So, yes. But again, you can see how the skyline is broken by the mansion house just behind the Guildhall to the right of the picture. What intrigues most people is the foreground, which looks very dark, but at the bottom right corner, you've got the roof of the Scarborough Bay of the original station. And then, of course, at this time, you still have the long coal and lime station with its drops heading towards the Ouse. You can just make out in the sort of white block halfway along, if you follow the railway, the sort of open framework of the coal drops and the limestone drops. So limestone and coal taken towards the river. And of course, the tenements of what became Rougier Street, which included Simpson's Row and Queen Street, are down there on the right. It's a very, very important picture. It's before Lendal Bridge, before all the changes of the next 20 to 30 years, about 1852, 53, this one. And another famous Pumphrey one, there's one for Ian Tempest, the Red Tower, of course. It's a very good photograph, not only because it shows part of the medieval foundations of the tower, and it shows the condition it was in 1853, before George Fowler Jones restored it in 1857 and put that new hipped roof on it. I must add, in my researches into the newspaper archive, somebody wrote a very tart letter to the York Herald saying it looks so new it should be called the White Tower now. You do get little quips like that in the newspapers. And of course, the huge shadow, very faded in the print, huge shadow on the right in the background is, of course, the county hospital. And again, it shows, for those unfamiliar with York, why that road is called Foss Islands Road. It is still very marshy and boggy at that stage. It wasn't really until 1855 that Thomas Pickersgill started draining the foss and creating this new area of land, which we know as Foss Islands Road. So again, it completed the circle of the ring outside the city walls. So Pumphrey's photos, they're very good in terms of the subject matter. Again, because it's this early grainy type of calotype photograph, some of the definition is a bit faded, and they tend to print them in sepia, which we haven't done in the book. They're printed in plain black and white. Roger Fenton, yes, some of you will know as he was the Crimean War photographer. So I'll just move on. There you are, just wading through all the Pumphrey pictures. So Fenton's most famous picture, of course, is the River Ouse. That would be impossible to take now. You'll be inside the abutments of Lendal Bridge. But again, you've got John Lehman, the ferryman, with his stovepipe hat there, with possibly a passenger. And again, Ouse Bridge in the background. And one thing we tend to forget are all the large warehouses on the right. Now, that block on the right is interesting. You may recall we had a visit to Scampston Hall recently. Now, in Scampston Hall, they've got a lot of William Marlowe paintings. Now, the Marlowe painting we know is that one of Ouse Bridge, taken from the site of Skeldergate Bridge, showing the wall. He's got a William Marlowe painting taken from more or less this viewpoint, looking at the buildings on the right where Blundy and Clark's warehouse was later situated. And it's fascinating, quasi-medieval looking building with an arch beneath it. Now, artistic license or not, I don't know, but I would love to see another print of that picture by William Marlowe around 1763. This, of course, is 1854. Very familiar with this one. There is another one that Fenton took, but we can actually zoom into that one. So that is Lop Lane. Now, when you see that picture offhand, you would think it was Precentor's Court until you look at the orientation of the west window of the Minster. And it's actually, you're looking along what is now Duncan Place, with clearly on the left, the Red House. The tree beyond with the gas lamp was the site of the Catholic chapel, the predecessor to St. Wilfrid's, well set back. And I've yet to see a photo of that earlier Catholic chapel. And of course, all the houses on the right were the ones that were demolished to create Duncan Place in around 1864. A lot of records and pieces in the newspapers about this great improvement. Darrell Buttery mentioned that one of the fireplaces from one of those houses on the right is the one that's in the common room at Pocklington School. Heaven knows how it got there, and it's such a big fireplace for such a small common room. It's on one long wall, and it looks too big, and Darrell hypothesized that it came from one of these houses. George Washington Wilson is where we start to get into the more of the modern age, because he used the wet type sort of glass plates. So his pictures, again, portraiture, if you're prepared to stand, wet plate, 15 minutes again, but with dry plate process, the long exposure doesn't matter. So you could just take a very nice, clean architectural image, and his photos are really quite special. I say that with a sort of aesthetic viewpoint, but the composition is very good. There with St. Wilfrid's, obviously just after it was built, 1863, the stonework still gleaming. You can actually trace the line from Blake Street going in a sort of zigzag off to the right, a kind of implied, trying to lead you into the photo. Very clever, George Washington Wilson. It tends to avoid a lot of the vertical problems that you get with perspective shots. The verticals are nice. The advantage of photography over graphic design, I rather like this because there's a lovely print in The Builder about the building of St. Wilfrid's. And it just shows how architects' drawings can somehow be embellished with the tower looking far more slender than it actually is. And sort of a lot of emphasis on the vertical that you wouldn't see otherwise. But the photo's honesty just brings out that clearly. There is, I think, yes, because it was George Washington Wilson who really recorded the halfway stage just after all the buildings on the right that you saw in the Fenton picture were demolished, and we have an unobstructed view of the Minster. Now, not only it shows St. Wilfrid's on the left, if you look at the Minster to the right, the south transept, you can't see it very well in this image, but those are slates on the roof of the south transept. We tend to forget that George Edmund Street was brought in 1875 to virtually rebuild the exterior of the south transept. Now, at the same time, in 1879, Street was designing the Central Criminal Court in London. And I always playfully think, if you look at the image of the Central Criminal Court in London, it has a tripartite set of louvers over the entrance. It has a rose window above the main door. I can't help thinking he took his inspiration from the Minster when he was designing that place. But you'll notice, the sharp-eyed will notice on the gable of the south transept drum turrets and a rather large pinnacle on the gable end. And of course, they were taken down in 1875 when Street redid the wall of the south transept. He was supposed to have redesigned the interior as well, but there's a very tart letter in the Herald at the time saying Bradley, the carver, was very clear that Street only wanted the exterior of the south transept to be remodeled, not the interior. And he wrote a very sort of snipey letter to the York Herald about this when they suggested he'd rebuilt the entire south transept. So the south transept we know is by George Edmund Street, the Victorian architect, really. And I thought, if you look at the stonework of the south transept, you can tell that's machine cut stonework. And with this, he put a small cross, which was removed after the fire in 1984. Then we come to George Fowler Jones. Now, Fowler Jones, of course, is better known as an architect. He was a member of the Yorkshire Architectural Society, later YAYAS, as was his son, Gascoigne Hastings Fowler Jones. As well as an architect, he was a very, very keen photographer. Indeed, he gave it up and photographed most of the things he had built. In the book, there's a huge comprehensive list with about 50 images that George Fowler Jones took. Some are marked ES for Evelyn Collection. They're Evelyn slides. Some are unmarked. We just don't know where they are. But he's about 200 in all. But of York, there are at least, I'd say, 80 photographs. We do have some in the collection. One is very appropriate at the moment. Some weeks ago, I met with Guy Hansen and Ed Friedman because you see these railings on Bootham. That was taken from George Fowler Jones's home in around 1862. And on the left, that is the York to Scarborough railway line curving away into the distance. So in effect, I live in the middle distance in one of those muddy fields. I was rather pleased about that. It's where the Newbury Street estate was built. But those cast iron palisades you can just see on the left going along the railway line, of course, the Grosvenor Terrace side, they are still there just. There is one brick pier on the Bootham Park side still standing. As Bill will know, it used to have a signal screwed to it. That's why it's still there, now covered in weeds. Now, the weeds and the growth are a problem because, once again, like I did before, I've introduced a modern picture to show you the state of affairs now. And without gilding the lily too much, we're trying to get the NHS to look after the railings on Bootham and I went up with Ed Friedman and Guy Hansen to take a look at the state of the railings on Bootham Park, and they're going to get them to clear the vegetation. So like the picture on the left, we can get a clear view of the railings as George Fowler Jones saw them. I mean, they were only 4 years old when he took this picture. One little detail you notice on the left near the gate, in each panel of the railings, there are little spikes about halfway through. Well, they didn't have anti-climbing paint in 1862. So yes, you can't, they are still there near the gate. You can't put your foot through there. All the rest were taken in World War II. They were simply sawn off. But the railings are still there in a very dangerous state of repair. The top right picture of the state of the palisades on Grosvenor Terrace. They're from 1845. They're the originals, and Network Rail have allowed the vegetation to grow. It's undermining the supports. So one or two are leaning out rather precariously towards Grosvenor Terrace. But it's nice that George Fowler Jones had the time to take a photo out of his window. He lived in number 78. It's now called Hudson House, a rather nice brick building across from these railings. And of course, he had an artist's eye for composition. On the left, of course, you've got North Street postern with the hospitium viewed through the arch. And he's got a man with his cart rather nicely poised there, just to take you through the image, like a trompe-l'oeil effect. Worth pointing out, of course, the hospitium was rebuilt in 1930. Don't tell the tourists. Okay, with the much steeper pitched roof, and the small single-story extension on the end is now added into the main building. And of course, you know that photo would now be impossible to reproduce because you'd be under Lendal Bridge. And again, it's one of those things, it just shows how these new sites like Lendal Bridge can dominate an image. You've got the steps down to the ferry on the right. Now, speaking of the right, of course, that picture is in this book, and it's one that's well known. It's Lady Mill on Burton Lane, roughly where the Suzuki Centre is now, on Burtonstone Lane. There are several windmills in the Evelyn collection, as we know. Sandra did a very good piece in York Historian a few years ago about all the various windmills in the collection. Let's move on to John Ward Knowles. Again, one of the upshots of this new collection we've got from Hugh and Jill is that there is a full plate picture of John Ward Knowles. Now, in the book, they've cut it down so you just see his head and shoulders and the vent of the projector. So for the record, we now have the full image of John Ward Knowles, obviously self-portrait in a mirror with his camera. We've had the benefit recently of a friend called Nigel Kirby, who was part of the redecoration and the rebuilding of 35 Stonegate, John Ward Knowles' home. And about 2 years ago, during the COVID pandemic, he said, would YAYAS like my collection of images of 35 Stonegate before anybody moved in? Oh, yes, please. For the sole use of YAYAS. Yes, thank you very much. And so hopefully there'll be an article in York Historian about these. There are about 30 images that Nigel Kirby took inside John Ward Knowles' house. They're all as clean as that on the left. So no furniture, no occupations, so just the bare building showing the medieval timbers in the roof and all John Ward Knowles' stained glass. So before it got cluttered with a new tenant. Not to disparage the tenants, but of course, we're able to see it nice and open like that. And of course, Knowles' pictures, he took well before he became a stained glass artist. He took up stained glass later, but he was really more of a photographer. It's a very, very clear image, obviously, of the photo we saw earlier, looking back across the Ouse to the Tower of North Street Poston, or Barker Tower. It's worth pointing out there's a derrick on the left unloading, so it must be before 1861 when the work to build Lendal Bridge started. On the right, you've got the Eber Works of Summers Varville, the plane manufacturer. So that was always the one. I always used to, as a tour guide, I used to say, well, you know, before the railways came, there was nothing outside the city walls. Well, how wrong was I on that one? Varville's works. Obviously, he had a business on Micklegate as well. And clearly, Varville's works is now really the site of Memorial Gardens. Just try and put yourself in the picture. In the middle distance beyond Barker Tower, if you look towards, you can just see the canopy of the station in the background, the Scarborough platforms. But now, instead of a coal stave going up to the Ouse, you have what appears to be a large brick wall across the middle of the picture. That is the supporting wall of the carriage sidings. I'm sure many of you have seen that famous picture showing the carriage sidings of the old station stopping abruptly before Rougier Street and the arch was knocked through the wall. Well, that is the other side of that wall. So it shows you how elevated those coach sidings were. What I find a bit puzzling is what looks like the city wall just to the left of Barker Tower. Looks much taller than we know it now. And obviously, can we see that North Street Poston's cut through in 1840 under the auspices of George Hudson? And again, with the money he gained from giving the authority, the council, that to knock that Poston through, they used the money to renovate the Barbican of Warngate Bar. Again, historic in so many ways. 1860s, what you now know as St Helens Square. Again, this is taken from the book. To try to pin the date down, I tried to look in the newspaper archive, and it's really by 1865, the shopkeeper on the right, whose name I can't see, I looked him up in the newspaper archive, and by 1865, he was trading in Micklegate. So before 1865, he was in St Helens Square. So we can push the date back a little bit, really, to 1862, 63, something like that. Moving on a little bit. Joseph Duncan, I must admit, it's one of my favourites because, again, he used the collodion process. So it's more of a dry plate technology. So for dry plate technology, really, yes, it's a long exposure, but as you're taking pictures of buildings, it doesn't really matter in the sense. And Duncan's are extremely clear. I'll give you that one for a start. It's hard to believe it's the same period as John Ward Knowles. Joseph Duncan's sort of dry plate technology. Obviously Minster Gates. And you've got the statue of Minerva on the left, as you see. My favourite street lamp in York in those days, obviously, was a gas lamp, since replaced with an electric lamp. And then those unfamiliar that the electric lamp was knocked over by a DPD driver in March 2022 and re-erected, one hopes with the van driver's insurance, in March 2023, and we're very glad about that. But you can see the predecessor was a gas lamp, of course, and you can see the crossbars, which is why at the time Steve Lewis said, well, was it a gas lamp, John, that was knocked over? It's 24 feet high. I'll have a bit difficulty lighting that. It was electric. And of course, Duncan's interesting because I'll come to him later and come up to Augustus Michalski. They must have known one another because there's another Duncan image, which me as an ex-railwayman, I'm rather fond of this one. And again, it's taken from the book. Obviously, you're standing outside what is now the Museum Gardens. You're looking over Lendal Bridge. And obviously, there's no Yorkshire Gentlemen's Club on the left. Lendal Bridge, relatively new. the building in the background often confuses people until I tell them, well, it's still there. You notice the West offices. It's the former Station Hotel from 1853-55, one of George Townsend Andrews' last buildings, really, because it's now hidden by the huge 1906 Northeastern Railway offices, now the Grand Hotel. And again, it's a useful image because, again, Duncan captures a moment in time that other photographers didn't see. Very few photographers took pictures looking the other way. The only time you see pictures looking the other way was in the 1866 Great Exhibition, where they had these temporary arches around the city. And that tested the mettle of many of the York photographers, as well as the architects designing temporary arches. And again, a very useful picture for YAYAS, because as the Yorkshire Architectural Society in 1848, we funded the renovation of that church. Indeed, if you look at the ends of the aisles, not the tower, but the two aisles, you can see the new stonework. When you walk past it today, you can still see that 1848 stonework around the window. That church was almost taken to the ground when it was restored. There is a drawing in the Evelyn collection of a man sitting among the ruins of the church during the restoration, and all you see are the arches of the arcades. The tower, well, that wasn't restored until 1913. One of the things you find with church restorations is an initial surge of money, and then it fades out. So by the time they get to the tower, like St. Lawrence's, had to wait 10 years, you have to wait for the tower to be finished. And even now you can tell the stonework of the tower is far newer than the rest. So again, it captures a moment in time. I rather like the later photos, of course, of this church in Hugh's great book on where to go in York, A History of Public Loos. There is another photo of St. Sampson's a bit later, which, where those billboards are, shows a mysterious glass waiting shelter. If you ever see that in old photos of York, and you will, that's the gentleman's urinal. Yes, so it was actually underneath the paving. Now, I'm indebted to Ros Batchelor of the York and District Family History Society, who I think is here tonight. Hi, Ros, thank you very much. Last night, she sent me an email because at the Sheriff Hutton History Fair, I mentioned how Rita Wood was doing a piece on the YPS on the drinking fountain and George Fowler Jones and some of his work. And she said, I've got this photo. I can see the name in the bottom right. Do you know anything about him? And I said, well, he's John Larden Draffin. He's mentioned in the book. There are a couple of his photos in the archive. They're not in the book. This photo is not in the book. But it was interesting because he's written his name in the bottom right, John Draffin. And when I said John Larden Draffin, the Sheriff Hutton History Fair a couple of Saturdays ago, Ros gently picked me up and said she's done his family history as John Lawton Draffin. Now, for some reason, they've misread his name as John Larden Draffin. And in Hugh's book, it gives him some details about his biography. But Hugh said he went bankrupt in 1862. Indeed, he did, but he carried on working. And by 1879, I think, was it, Ros, he moved to Bridlington, where he worked out his latter years, and he lived another 20 years doing carte de visite, little portrait photos. So Draffin continued really personal photographs rather than architectural ones. So there's very few Draffin. There's a Draffin photo in the book, a very grainy image from Duncan Place looking side on at St. Wilfrid's. So that's the only Draffin photo in the collection. So here's another one that most of you will not have seen before. Of course, St. Thomas's in the Groves opened in 1853 with the school next door. I think that's why Rita was interested in this one. She was doing a piece for YPS on George Fowler Jones and his architectural work. But again, you got Draffin's signature, rather like Handstock signing his photos later on. Draffin, August Michalski. Now, this is where I'm going to get back to Joseph Duncan. Michalski, and again, Ros put me onto an article in Historical Photographer. Photo historian, thanks, Ros. About 2 years ago, 2021, somebody did an article on August Michalski. Now, if any of you drop me an email, I'll send you a copy of the article if you wish. It's about 6 pages and it gives quite a detailed life of Augustus Michalski and where he worked and where he was in York. He had his best known, obviously, shop was in Stonegate, and I'm going to come to that in a moment. But he did work on Micklegate and other bits of York, and he was a very, very long-lived photographer. But again, this article, I only read it last night, so the knowledge is still fresh in my mind, but he had a very long and productive life. Now, I go back to Joseph Duncan, because remember that image we saw earlier that Duncan took of Minster Gates? He took one looking the other way. So there's the gas lamp. And on the left-hand side of the picture, to the left of the gas lamp, Michalski portraits, photographs. That's Michalski's photograph studio. That's why I've put it on this slide. So again, 1870 photo by Duncan there, showing Stonegate, much as it is now. Obviously, the building on the right, much restored. For you building historians, of course, I know it says Anno Domini 1646 on the corner pier of that building to this day. But of course, if you've looked through David Palliser's book on medieval York, you'll know that they had a dendrochronologist take tree samples from the roof of each end of that building on the right, and they both came up with the same date, 1323. So again, a photo can tell you so much in one image. And obviously the building much restored now, but it gives you some idea. But that's Michalski's studio on the left. And one of his pictures on the right. Again, this often confuses visitors when they first see these photos. Why isn't that arch still there? Well, it was made of wood and plaster. What was it made for? The 1866 Great Exhibition in Bootham Park. Of course, after 1851, everybody wanted a great exhibition, and York had one in a temporary building in 1866. And people like Fowler Jones, Herbert Fippard were asked to design triumphal arches around the city for the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, and his consort, Alexandra, to come and open the great exhibition. And there are many, many photos of the exhibition, its interior, its items, of course, the carver Job Cole, his work, and of course, photography played a large part of that. But these arches, that one, of course, on Ouse Bridge, there was one on St Leonard's Place, there was one on Lendal Bridge going to Lendal Tower, and there was one on Bootham, a much smaller one, and that is in the book, one of the Draffin photos. So these were later sold as carte de visits of the Great Exhibition in 1866. So that photo has to be 1866. Now, I want to keep this talk fairly short. I can't let you go without a little snippet of what's to come. This new collection from Hugh and Jill Murray. Florence Wright had a camera. I am so glad that Florence Wright had a camera, because around 1969, 70, 73, she took a series of photos of Clarence Street. There, on the left. Now, just about every building in that image is gone. Where are you? You're standing at the end of Clarence Street. Lord Mayor's Walk is off to the picture to your right. Gillygate is behind you. You're looking at Union Terrace and the Regent Cinema. You're looking at the car park now. And of course, the Fountains Learning Centre, yeah? The Grand, thank you, David. The Grand Cinema, which again stood until I think it was the 80s, and they knocked it down to extend the car park. It was a victim really of the Inner Ring Road scheme in 1971, compulsorily purchased Union Terrace and of course Marygate for something that was never built. So they both became car parks. But again, so that's De Grey Terrace on the right, leading to De Grey Street. So in a way, the footprint of that is now recreated near the Fountains Learning Centre. But that's how it looked in around 1972. You can see the building right in the middle of the photo, the rafters, the slates have come off. So it is in process of being demolished. Its neighbours, you can just see by the Volkswagen dealership, its neighbours have already gone. And what I like about Florence's pictures, again, around 72, 73 on the right, unmistakably, Whitmer-Watmergate, where I rather chuckled at the antiquated cars. Yeah, I can identify most of them, but it's fitting that sheer number of cars in that space. You walk by there now, of course you can't at the moment because they're putting the bollards in, but you can barely fit 3 modern cars in that space. It's one thing you notice about old houses. Again, I've mentioned it before. There's Susan Major will know there is one of the semi-detached houses on Bishopthorpe Road near the Winning Post that still has an original garage, and the owner has a VW Golf and it can't fit. It's too wide. And as a wide person myself, I appreciate modern cars are wider, but you can just see the Minis, the Humbers, and what have you sitting there, and the Hillman Imp, that you fit those cars in there. I think I've waffled on about long enough. Any questions? I'm sure you must have some. Yes, right at the back. Yes. Somebody's asked, what about Photographic Lane by Bootham School? Now, several people recently have asked about this one because the sign went up quite lately. Now, when I moved to Newborough Street in '86, it was still a photographic studio. KL photographers who later moved up to Poppleton Road, if memory serves. It was a photographer on the corner, and it's a very, very good piece of restoration that the big shop window has been taken out of that building on the corner, the Georgian building, and they replaced it with reasonable copies of the original windows. And somebody must have got wind it was a photographer's, and hence Photographic Lane. As far as I know, that's why it's called Photographic Lane. Yeah, yeah, go on. Yeah. When did the gas lamps outside the Minster get changed? I don't know is the simple answer to that one. They're certainly there in the 90s. So I'm going back to the 80s, I would have thought. And the main must still be there because there were gas lamps there before. They're certainly not in Monkhouse's picture in the 1840s showing the Minster fire, but that may have a bit of artistic license in it, showing the West End with a trooper with the flames licking up the West End, destroying the door. There's no sign of a gas lamp there, but yeah, outside the south door. Yeah, the south door, the gas lamps there, they were done recently in the paving of that part of Minster Yard. People often say, well, why didn't they do archaeology there? Well, there are too many services. This is why the bollards at the end of Minster Gates were delayed. You've got gas pipes, you've got water mains, sewers, electric, you know. So those lamps, yes, I'd love to know where the gas main goes. Let's hope they don't try and put any bollards outside the south door. It could get messy, let's be honest. Any more questions? Yeah, Jonathan.
The streets are very empty. Is that because they were not exposed to them taking
Well, for those on Zoom, Jonathan French just asked, a lot of the photos, why are they fairly empty street scenes? Most of them, it's because of the long exposure times. I mean, you remember, was it Daguerre who took that photo of the man unwittingly becoming the first person to have his photo taken? He's having a boot boy polishing his shoes, and the boot boy is a blur, but the man is sitting, and you can see his leg quite clearly. Now, with a lot of the color type pictures, with 15 minutes, you're not going to get many people there, or they'll just be a blur on the image. I would suspect if I were a landscape photographer in those days, I would have chosen early morning when the streets are quieter, as people still do today. Yeah, for the benefit of those on Zoom, Bill Fawcett said, of course, John Shannon would take photos early in the morning. And of course, we had the example of the lockdown in 2020, where you had your daily walk and Shambles was devoid of people in the middle of the day. And of course, there were fewer people around in the 1860s. The population of York would have been about 30,000. So again, there are a few people around. But then, yeah, partly early day of the morning. Although looking at Draffin's photo of St. Thomas's, I assume that's liturgical west rather than geographical west, south facing. So the sun will be on it. So that's probably mid-morning. looking at the shadows from the bell cut. You can see so much in a photo like this. So again, he probably picked his moment. I don't think he'd say, "Oh, he clear off," so all the urchins running down the street, but he'd probably choose his moment. And that must be around 1859. The church opened in 1853, and you can see the stonework still looks very clean. So it's somewhere between 1850. Pardon? Yes. Yeah. That's very kindly. Ross Batchelor has said that, of course, at that time, Draffin lived on Grove Terrace. That would have been his local parish church. In fact, it's taken from an upstairs window, so he may have persuaded somebody if he could use their room or go from his house itself. And again, it's an important picture. It's got his name scribbled in the right. And of course, with the later Handstock photos, we're so used to seeing Handstock's name in the bottom corner, written on a leg or on a piece of furniture. Well, Draffin did the same, as early form of copyright, of course. Yeah, certainly is. I mean, you look at the school in the background, newly opened. Even the windows, the central window's not in yet, or it's open, or it's simply not there. I can't believe it's been removed. It wouldn't have been. And again, it's the way that you cast that. It's like Fowler Jones's photo of Bootham Park, the whiteness of the stone, the crispness of everything, something we tend to miss now when we see it all decayed after 160 years or more. I mean, you go to, let's say, yeah, I mean, that one of Duncan's, how clean everything seems. And again, yeah, the questions of the exposure time, those people, I don't think they're posed. I think they're just au naturel. A man looking into the shop, and the children in the background. I don't think they'd stand stock still for 15 minutes unless he persuaded them.
John, before you move on.
Yeah.
Does that, just to the right of the lamppost,
yes,
that say Duncan?
It does. That's well spotted. Yeah, Ian Drake has spotted that the shop you know as Hebden Tea now, and I remember as Minstergate's model shop, is Duncan. It's Joseph Duncan's studio, and there are photos in the window. Bit of self-publicity, but it's rather nice that he took a photo looking the other way of August Michalski's photograph studio, which implies some sort of comradeship between the two. So go back to, yeah. Yes. And Draffin. Yeah. Yeah. Right. You got rifle volunteers. Yes. Ros Batchelor said that Michalski and Duncan and Draffin. Michalski and Draffin were both in the Yorkshire Rifle Volunteers, and you'll know the drill hall on St Andrew Gate. They were both members of the Yorkshire Rifle Volunteers. So these photographers clearly lived near each other, had their offices and their studios near each other. And I'm starting to think of Stonegate as sort of a photographer's street now. You can't think of it. I mean, with Knowles's building further down, with all the stained glass, you're thinking of all these great images. And even, I'll go back to the Knowles image, if I may. Let's go back. I'm going forwards. I'm sorry, I've gone the wrong way. I do apologise. Bear with me. I'm just going back to John Ward Knowles. I didn't put too many Knowles pictures in because I'm trying to keep the talk down to sort of 40 minutes and so. But again, that Knowles turned to stained glass in the end. One wonders if he'd stayed with photography, what he would have produced had he stuck with photography. But again, if you ask our archivist, we do have about 35 images of 35 Stonegate. All the floors, the alleyway outside, they've been left to YAYAS by Nigel Kirby. It's why I've cited him on that picture. So if you're a bona fide researcher doing that building, it'll be worth picking Nigel's brains because, as I say, he took some wonderful pictures before all the furniture went in. And again, one of those, on the subject of early photographers, a sort of a long-standing request from John Mackenzie, who was another sort of ex-railway man. Are there any photos of the railway station being built? And as
British railway station.
the 1877 station.
I don't think the railway commission.
No.
So you just got this stated later on. So
Hmm. Yeah.
was a bit too early.
Yeah.
They didn't feel the need to help.
Right. I
It's
mean,
very pity.
yes, I said to John Mackenzie, have you tried the NERA, the North East Railway Association? I think, well, I don't think they will have. You say they were commissioned, so they weren't.
No, I don't think it would be any. The photographs we have are the photographs which were taken by the iron factor, that is
Hmm.
of the interior.
Yeah.
Whether that commissions and photographs.
Yeah.
That's quite possible. But nobody, I'm not
Hmm.
aware of any.
Because it occurred to me, because the railway station, when it was being built, if there are any photos out there in daguerreotype, well, there'll be wet plate photos by then, glass plate photos of the station, will be intriguing because of something I found in the newspapers about the brickwork of the station and the fact that there was a strike in 1875 by John Keswick, the well-known brickmaker and hater of trades unions, and always ending up in court. He lost the contract to build the station, and it was sent to, was it Lucas or Lewis of London in the end to complete the brickwork.
But basically lost the contract because of the strike. He was waiting.
Hmm.
He couldn't show on that.
No.
And I think he probably almost voluntarily withdrew.
Hmm. It's just intriguing that if there were a photo of the station partly built, it would add grist to that sort of story about a little bit of trade unionism in York. It's one of the things that I'm interested in. Not much more to say, really. Are there any questions online, Graham? None. Okay. No. Yeah.
And I actually found that the John Getty Museum has some of his work.
Wow. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were all series of, we had a series of figurette series, well, almost particularly exteriors, interiors, and he did the barns as well, and they were all, he seemed to be a landscape photographer.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was the other point. Was, that really all of them had second ways of making income. It really didn't seem like you could easily make your living as a photographer. So when Drafton and his wife left Grove Terrace, they went to Church Street, and he's down as the draper and photographer. And when they went to Bridlington, they started running what seemed to be a highly successful restaurant on the promenade there, and presumably did photography on the prom as well. But there, I came across somebody we all mentioned George Brown, and he was a photographer on Marion Terrace, which I think that's him.
Yes.
And his brother-in-law was also, but he was a tobacconist.
Yes. Yeah. For the benefit of those on Zoom, Ros Batra has mentioned that Draffin, of course, was known mainly for stereoscopic views. So you get the binary views, obviously, for the stereograph. The gimmick of the great desire of the Victorians was to have a stereoscopic image, largely of cathedrals. What was the one you say about Mahalski? Mahalski was one for events. There's a Mahalski picture showing the cutting of the first sod for the rebuilt Neyburn Lock in 1887 with the then Lord Mayor. Would it have been Terry? Yeah, I recognise him in the photo. Yeah, it's not in the book, but Mahalski was one of these who, again, was one for events. Any big event, Mahalski would be there. And the Mahalski picture in 1887 was going to go in the newspaper, but of course they didn't have the technology to reproduce the photos to any decent quality. So effectively, you got a news article and a picture from two separate sources describing the same thing. It interests me because Thomas Francis Wood was the driving force behind that of the Hughes Management Committee at the time. So again, photos can also be events. I prefer architectural photos because that's my thing, and the book is full of architectural photos, but it mentions George Brown, the photographer, in the back of the book. Now, Brown was a relative of John Brown, the historian of the Minster. Yeah, Brown with an E on the end, or Brown without an E, depending on which census they were using. But they were both, I think, eventually Catholic, and but John Brown was their father, and he was the Minster historian. So they went into the photography business. I have a personal interest in the other photographer whose work is not in the book, but you will be familiar with his work because it was Walter Gowland, famous for portraits of people like Joseph Terry and people like that. And I must admit, because his grandson was Fred Gowland, who I met age 6 because he was married to one of my Shaws. Hooray! So I'm distantly related to Walter Thomas Gowland and Gowland's court down Oglethorpe, which they've renamed Oglethorpe Mews. I'm disgusted. I'm taking it personally. But yeah, I actually met Lavinia Gowland when I was age 6, living up Elmfield Avenue, and I couldn't tell where her couch stopped and her dress started. They were both made of the same fabric. But I did meet Fred, her husband, and he was the grandson of Walter Thomas Gowland. So the Gowland family obviously have a progeny, but I'm related to one of them, thankfully. There's always a relative in there somewhere, Rosemary, isn't there? Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Did Pumphrey run an asylum? Yeah, yeah. Well, he was a Quaker. Pumphrey was a Quaker, and of course, it's hardly surprising. But it's, yeah. But to summarize, Pumphrey's photos, there are many, many, many of them in the Evelyn collection. We have many of the Pumphrey images. If you look in the book, it'll say ES, Evelyn slide, Evelyn slide, Evelyn slide. So William Pumphrey's, we have many of those. The George Washington Wilson are held by Glasgow University. They really hold the originals of those. Yeah. Any more questions? Any observations? Well, thank you. I thought I wouldn't have enough to say, but there's plenty enough. And obviously the story goes on because now, as we know, Draffin went on beyond 1862. So bankruptcy need not be the end. It certainly wasn't the end for John Keswick, was it, Susan? No. So yeah, we'll hope to see some of you in December for the walk around James Piggott Pritchett's buildings with Victoria Hopgood. There was one upshot of that, just as sort of an additional notice. Keith Knight, who's a member of YAYAS and used to work for Brierley, Leconbury, Keighley and Groom. Why don't we have an Architects' Day? Where people do 45-minute presentations. Now, I dare look at Bill and say George Townsend Andrews, but of course you've got George Styan. You've got some of the lesser-known architects. Something for me to organise, I think, for next year when the days get longer and the nights get warmer. Perhaps at the Cemetery Chapel, if I have a chat with them there and see if we can have a sort of symposium on other York architects, because I'm sure that Keith will want to do Walter Brierley, because you can't do York architecture without Walter Brierley. But there are so many other architects who are less well known, like Styan, Enoch George Morby, whose work is around you. You're familiar with it, but you don't know much about them. I found out so much about Pritchett, and I shall find out some more on Wednesday, the 6th of December, when I hope to see some of you. So, failing that, this is our last meeting before January, so I bid you the compliments and have a safe Christmas. Thank you.